Welcome to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. I am your host, Molly Southgate, and today I'm interviewing.
Donna Gordon.
Hi, how are you doing today?
I'm good. Good to meet you, Molly. Thanks for having me.
It's great to meet you too. Thank you so much for coming on. I know I was saying this to you right before we started recording, but I am obsessed with your book. It is
Oh,
so heartfelt and beautiful, and I'm like totally like living in the world of it right now.
I really appreciate that. I really do. Thank you.
Can you tell me a little bit about it?
Yes, it was a sort of an unlikely story. My novel, it's my debut novel, my first novel. So it's called What Ben Franklin Would Have Told Me. It's both historical fiction and literary fiction. And it tells the story of a 13-year-old boy named Lee who has a disease called progeria, which is a premature aging disease. So his body ages at an accelerated rate while his brain ages at an age appropriate rate. And he has a caretaker named Tomas, who is a survivor of the Dirty War in Argentina, which took place between 1976 and 1983 under a dictator named Jorge Videla. And so the story is it starts out in the city of Newark, New Jersey, where Lee lives with his single mother, Cass, who's a makeup artist for Broadway. And Tomas is his caretaker during the day because as Lee is getting older, his body is weakening and he needs help in his self care and in his daily routines. So it's set there. And then what happens in the story is that Lee is an American history buff and a Ben Franklin fan. That's where the Ben Franklin comes in. And so he has a final wish to visit all of the American history landmarks in Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia, at first with his mother, and then she can't take him. So his caretaker agrees to take him, and they go on a journey. And once there, the caretaker, Tomas, reveals to Lee that he has reason to believe his missing wife and child have relocated there. So when they arrive in Washington, D.C., it becomes sort of a detective story.
I love that so much how it did go into more of a detective style story and like all of the different things happening. Like every character definitely like has their own motivations. And I loved the way that you tied that all together. How did you characterize them? Like what sort of work did you have to do to plot out these points?
Okay, there is a story there. I had two separate experiences, which sort of each one led me to a different character. So I had been a volunteer at a camp in Sebago, Maine. It was called Camp Sunshine, and I was there as a photographer. And the camp was for kids with life-threatening illnesses and their families. And so while I was there, I met all kinds of kids, one of whom had progeria. And I actually never met the boy. I only saw him from a distance, but he stayed in my mind and I learned about the disease. And it was a very moving experience overall to see children really too young to have to think about such tough things as their survival and their fate. So I had that experience. And then shortly after that, I had done a volunteer project with Amnesty International for which I interviewed and photographed 15 people on their speakers list. And they were all living in the US when I met them, but they were from all over the world. And two of the people I met had been survivors of the dirty war in Argentina, and they stayed in my mind also. And I can't quite rationally explain how I paired the boy with progeria with one of the former political prisoners, but somehow the idea of accelerated time for Lee, the boy, and lost time for Tomas, the former political prisoner, somehow that made them converge for me. That was sort of the beginning of how they came together. And each of them had sort of a tremendous loss and need and kind of deficit in their emotional lives. So somehow they gravitated together for me in my imagination.
And we have both of them like kind of like Tomas is trying to learn how to be like possibly a father again. Like, and then we've got Lee who's learning how to be like a kid and trying to keep that part of himself, even though he is worried about where he's going.
That's
That was something that I picked up on while reading it, where I was like, "Ooh, I loved how those were interconnected like that."
yeah, I think you're right about that. Yeah. And let's not forget Patrick, Lee's Vietnamese pot-bellied pig. He's
Hmm.
in there mostly for um, comic relief, I'd say, because it is sort of a potentially dark pairing of with life-threatening disease and torture, but hopefully it rises above those possibilities.
It definitely does. So, how did the book get the American history bent to it? Was that always there from the beginning, or did it sort of develop while you were writing?
Well, I feel that for Lee is an autodidact. He's self-taught. He's precocious. He's homeschooled. He is on his own a lot, and he sort of needs to believe in the facts of the world. And history comes to him as an anchoring structure because he has so much of his life that's unknown and uncertain. I made him something of a mock historian because that seems to give him some grounding in the world. And I also I gave him Ben Franklin because of the humor and the invention that Franklin is known for, and I felt that Lee Lee was also that way. He was that kind of personality, very inventive and humorous, and able to see multiple meanings in things. So that's how the American history got in there. And then, of course, I had to set it during the Reagan era because that's when the Dirty War took place in Buenos Aires. So that sort of cemented in that structure as well.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And as a homeschooler, I have known so many kids that are like that with like certain elements of history or like certain wars and things like that, where it's like you talk to them and they know every single detail ever. So reading it, I was like, hey, I've met this kid. It felt very real.
I'm glad. Yeah. I'd say I'm mostly him, believe it or not.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
When you were writing, was that something conscious that you were like putting in elements of yourself there, or did it just kind of spring up naturally?
It sort of happened naturally. I mean, I think that my curiosity throughout my life is I'm not as smart as Lee, even though I wrote him. I don't,
I You wrote a brilliant book.
oh, thank you. You know, that's the thing about writing. You sort of let go of your characters and let them become themselves. So, but I would say that, of course, you know things, but you don't think about them so overtly. You sort of channel them through your character in a
Mhm.
way that becomes almost subconscious, but they have to say things and do things. But I would say that I didn't, as Lee's character developed, as he did more and more things, I think I did push him a little bit more as I sort of recognized parts of myself. But then of course you're all of your characters in different ways. So I had to kind of pull back and put myself into my other characters in their own ways as I understood they might be from my experiences, like the mother, and I'm a mother, um, and all of the things I learned by interviewing former political prisoners and how terrible and difficult that world was. So I think I just let myself sort of channel what I felt was right among my different characters.
That is so fascinating. When you were writing this book, did you like do it over a long span of time, like was and like have projects in between, or was it something that you kind of just sat down and wrote?
Well, I think I was mentioning earlier on that I started out writing poetry. So what happened to me, I had been a Stegner Fellow at Stanford in poetry. And when I came back from there, I started writing longer sentences that were sort of stories, prose poems, stories. And as part of that journey, I started writing. Well, I wrote another novel before this one, which was unpublished. It was called Cave Paintings. And it was fairly autobiographical, but I had that experience of writing another novel. So I was sort of prepared for creating a structure and moving it along. And because my story is a journey story, it made it easier to do things in sections. I was part of a writing group with two other women who were very generous and very smart and very helpful. And so they shared their perspective. It took me from concept to it being bought about 7 years. But that was not in a linear way at all. It wasn't writing every day. I'd say I probably wrote it probably in about 4 years of sort of part-time writing, and then revised the whole thing from beginning to end 3 or 4 times. Um,
Wow.
yeah, so because I learned along the way, I didn't have a fiction writing background, I had a poetry writing background. And so to learn some of the formal elements of fiction and structure and character and dialogue and setting, and to really, shape my descriptions into a book that would stand up. I did have to learn a lot along the way. So the way I started the book, the language, the voice was fairly different from the language and voice that I ended with. So I did go back and I tried to unify the language, and it took me an embarrassingly long time. I have two children, and I've been, pretty much on my own with them. My husband has a business, and I was sort of on my own for a number of those years. So anyway, that's what I did. And I did write it for deadlines for each upcoming meeting of my workshop. I really took it very seriously. And I tried to complete an emotional transition in each section and not leave things hanging. So that was my strategy.
I think that's such an incredible story, and it
Thanks.
shows that like it it shows that like you can learn new styles and adapt, because I feel like that's something a lot where people kind of get pigeonholed, and it's like, oh, this is a fiction writer. They write fiction. But then you also wrote poetry and short stories, and also I saw on your website you're a visual artist too,
Yeah.
which I looked at some of your things and they're incredible. And it's so interesting how like adaptable we can be, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think life is about learning. I honestly do. And sometimes you can be blocked and not able to do something that you may have inside you, but if it's there, it'll come out another time, another way, another form. And people are lucky in life if they have moments of openness where they can be willing to try things and work at them, because mostly it's work.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about your poetry, like what kind of styles you gravitated towards and how it affected the writing of this novel?
Yes, I can. I was a pretty serious poet. I started writing poetry in high school, and and I spent a lot of time on it. I really did. And then when I got to college, I went to Brown undergrad, and I met a poet named Michael Harper, and he was very serious. We had a workshop, and he really got me to do more than I had ever done before. I was writing free verse poetry. Um, he was the kind of person you want to do right by, and I always wrote more than was asked for. I just was very devoted to him. He was a great teacher, and I took myself um, pretty seriously, but I revised quite a bit. It was all about revision. And then what Rilke had said, you probably know this line. Rilke, the poet, had said, ruthlessly compress. So that meant
Mm,
to really edit your work to as few words as possible, take out the unneeded words, and you're left with something more compelling. And so I took that experience of self editing very deeply into my fiction writing. And I really think that's a strength of mine that I got from writing poetry, is to sort of condense, to, be a visual thinker, to organize the images so that they're not extraneous, but that they sort of add up to something. I mean, image making is a little bit like building equations. I think you have to sort of, they have to add up. You can't just compare something. It has to be a whole chain of thought in a way. So I'm sorry, I'm going on and on and on here.
No, no, I think it's fascinating. And something
Uh,
really interesting about like when you're studying poetry, a lot of it is saying like compress, 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 but a lot of the ideas about like poetic fiction and things like that, or people think like, oh, it must just have like unnecessary imagery everywhere and just go on and on. And that really is like the opposite of what taught. Um,
uh, yeah, I think it's very much like making a drawing or a painting. I mean, it has all the, you don't want to have everything be necessarily logical, but you want to have it intersect enough so that it makes sense. And
okay.
so, yeah, so I think that the poetry writing and the editing and the music of language, I think people write sometimes because they do hear a certain music and language that one can't suppress. And if you sort of language gets merged with sound in a unique way, and I think that's partially what creates a writer. And I think that if you have that need, then you're lucky. What kind of poetry do you write?
Oh, I write a lot. I just kind of I don't know if I have a set style in particular. I haven't written too many prose poems, but I still love that. I write a lot that is very because I got my start in fiction writing, so a lot of my poetry is more fiction based.
Oh, that's
So it's
fun.
very much like these two characters are doing this thing, and then I say it in a way that's like more poetic, so no one else reading it you probably wouldn't pick up on it, but like in my head, I write it based off of a very clear image. It's the best way I can really describe it, but
Yeah.
I wish I had a better answer like yours.
It sounds like a narrative poem, like maybe you write a narrative poem, like a story that you sort of understand where it's headed. That's my guess.
Yes, it's usually a lot more like that,
Yeah,
or just a lot of very abstract things.
yeah.
So, kind of continuing on this, talking about like your writing and like your writing influences and things like that. What writer do you think is most like you writing wise?
Well, that's a tough one. I sort of made a list because I couldn't really settle on one. When I was first looking for an agent, years ago, the woman on the cover of Poets and Writers was a woman named Ellen Levine. She's an agent, and she was Marilyn Robinson's agent. And Marilyn Robinson wrote Housekeeping and Gilead and a bunch of other books. And so this agent told me that she thought my writing was a lot like Marilyn Robinson. But I also really like Michael Ondaatje, and who wrote The English Patient, and he wrote a memoir called Running in the Family. And he was also a poet. He is a poet also, as well as a fiction writer. I think maybe those two. I mean, I definitely think writers who use a lot of imagery. I think I can relate to. There's the prologue from Barbara Kingsolver's The Poisonwood Bible. Have you ever read that prologue?
I have not, no.
It's a real tour de force. It's a beautiful piece of writing, and it's somewhat elliptical. It's more, I don't know, it just asserts itself with language. So I think some of those people I may be similar to. I'm still finding out. I'm still figuring it out, but I see some comparisons.
That is a fantastic answer. I've got a whole new list of authors to check
Oh,
out.
yeah, yeah.
Do you have a favorite thing that you've ever written? So this could be your novel, or it could be a chapter of it, or a poem, or a short story, or anything.
Um, I have a section in my novel, in what Ben Franklin would have told me that does reverberate in my head sometimes. It's almost like a soliloquy that Lee delivers towards the end of his life, and so I do feel like that still resonates for me. So I'd say some of the language in the novel, which I did discover so much with in that book. So I'd say, yeah, something in there.
I'll be on the lookout as I get to that part.
Oh,
Um, I, I was just been thinking about this one section that you wrote in there about the the eating habits of the French and the
oh,
birds and all
oh,
that whole
yeah.
part. And it was, I don't know, it's just stuck in my head completely. And I keep thinking about it over and over again. And now I want to research it so
Oh,
much. And I think that like speaks to the power of this book because I can't get it out of my head. And there's so many parts like that that just kind of take up space, in a good
thanks. Well, the part that I'm referring to with Lee, it starts with the line, "I wanted to be more." And
way.
and that happens later. And you'll see, you'll get to that. And I think you'll understand why he feels that way.
That
Yeah.
I'm already so excited. That sounds like a beautiful section.
Thank you. Yeah. That's what an author wants. An author wants a reader like you who is so interested, and receptive. So you could be
Oh,
my ideal reader.
I am happy to be your ideal reader. I love this book so much, and I'm so excited. Do you think that you'll publish other things in the future?
I sure hope so. I mean, I think one of the things that has happened to me through this process is I really feel I've gone from being a writer to an author. And it sounds like it wouldn't be that big of a shift, but it actually is. And I feel like there are so many things that one worries about before one publishes the first book. And I think that I've sort of silenced a lot of those questions. And I do believe I'm an author now, and I do believe that, well, I'm completing a collection of short stories. I'm close to the finish of those. And I did start another novel. So I will definitely keep writing. My challenge is to sort of balance my fiction writing and my visual art. The visual art I've only been doing for a few years, but it's compelling as well.
Yeah, could you tell me a little bit about your visual art and does it ever interact with your writing at all?
Yeah, I started making. I drew when I was in high school. I liked to draw, and I used to take the bus into New York City from Elizabeth, New Jersey, where I lived, to take a life drawing class on Saturdays at the Art Students League. And then I hadn't drawn anything in more than 40 years, and I was a writing fellow at the Vermont Studio Center in Johnson, Vermont, and they had writers and visual artists there, and they had a life model every day, a nude model that you could draw for the morning. And so I was terrified to try it again, but I did go into that room and start drawing, and that sort of opened everything up for me again. And then so I started painting, but there is a big overlap. I'm definitely a visual thinker. I'm definitely my art tells a story, my writing uses imagery. But I did recently make a painting. It's actually this one behind us.
Oh,
And I made that after reading Ishiguro's Clara and the Sun, which I read a few months ago. And for some reason, I started channeling Clara in the painting, and she's you can't really see it, the sort of greenish painted head. Um, but yeah, so that was a direct um, effect of the book. Making that painting was directly in response to reading the book. And that's the first time that really happened to me. So I don't know if it'll happen again, um, but it did happen. And I sort of I felt heat coming through my body. It was weird.
that
That,
is so cool. I love when art influences other art like that.
yeah,
Um, because it can happen with so many different mediums. Like books can influence paintings or the other way around, or even like movies or songs or all different any art form. It can really like if it hits you right, you can have that sort of connection.
I think so. I think music in particular, music sort of suggests imagery to me. To me, it does. Yeah.
Oh, 100%. At least in I'm a musician.
Oh,
Um, and at least for my writing and everything with that, I definitely feel that way. That's part of why I've always been drawn to it because it has that very visual sense to it. And if I was a better visual artist, I would like
Oh,
to paint things like that.
do you play an instrument?
Yeah, I play guitar.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's great. Yeah, yeah.
Do you play any instruments?
Not really. A little bit of piano, but it's not my strength. Um, no, but I do hear music and language. It's very powerful for me.
Definitely. Does that relate to you for poetry only, or does it also appear in fiction and other areas?
It definitely appears in fiction as well because sometimes I'll start something I'm writing with sort of a phrase like a poetic phrase of words that come into my mind that don't necessarily make too much sense. I mean, they make enough sense, but it's not like I've thought of the story already, and then the story might develop from that phrase. So that's one way I've written. Um, yeah.
Oh, that's really interesting. I've had the same thing actually, where
Oh,
it's that
yeah.
kind of like sometimes you just need that jumping off point.
Absolutely. And I think it's even better when you haven't planned it.
Hmm.
I write a newsletter as part of my novel marketing experience. I was asked to write a newsletter. Mine's called Fiction and Other Truths. And I just wrote about how mark making in art is similar to a first draft in fiction. So mark making is just sort of like gestural drawing, and it's almost like what we're talking about, like a phrase of words, could start a first draft, the way some marks on the page could start a drawing or a painting. So I was trying to draw a parallel between the first draft and mark making in
Oh,
my
that's so cool.
in my post. Yeah.
And also, plug for anyone listening to this, go check out your newsletter because that
Yeah.
sounds great.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah. I can subscribe on my website, but yeah, I mean the whole marketing side and promotion side of a book. My publisher is a smaller literary press, Regal House, and so they really haven't had the staff to do that for me. And I've done most of it on my own. I did have a part time publicist for a while, but it was a real collaboration, and a lot of the connections I've made have been independently. So, yeah.
That's what's that been like for you as someone mostly doing the publicity for your book as well as like writing the book, having kind of
Um,
both hats for that.
a whole different kind of energy. I mean, the publicist was great, and um, she introduced me to that world, which I really was clueless about, and I'm grateful. But then, in terms of my own connections and persistence and sense of the community where I live, I realized I had more friends than I knew, and so
Hmm.
a lot of people have been very helpful, and and that's been unexpected. But I do think one has to be very persistent. Um, and it's not really my personality or my comfort zone, but I've learned how to work on it.
Yeah, you kind of have to
Yeah,
in this day and age with books and everything and how that works. That
yeah,
thank you for talking about that. That's it's something that I find so fascinating. And I always love when authors will bring that up on the show.
yeah. Well, one of the things is if you believe in your book and you truly believe in it, and people like you, who I do believe you're being honest that you like it, a lot of people have had a similar reaction, and that sort of makes me want to take it as far as I can so that people can have the experience.
And that's so amazing. That's the best that you can hope for as an author to have like many people that are like feel really impacted by the book. And to get to like kind of take that into your own hands. It must be cool.
Yeah, I think that every writer writes for themselves, and then if you can manage to deliver an experience like you're saying, then it makes you feel like you weren't alone in the world you created, that you created a world that was real enough or important enough that it means something independent of the author.
You're so right. Well, this has been such a fantastic interview. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you, Molly. I know I talked a lot, so
Oh, that's the point of this. I wanted to hear all about the book and all about you as a person, and this was so perfect. Thank you. I just have one last question, and that
okay.
is, what do you have coming up?
Oh, okay. So I have a few more events coming up for the book. I'm going to be at the Boston Book Festival on October 29th in the Belmont Public Library, and my book is the November pick of the Brown University Book Club of Boston. So anyway, so I have those specific events, if that's what you mean, and then I'm going to be working on my story collection. So and just trying to get back to writing and do less sort of marketing that I've done because I needed to. So
Well, that is so exciting. Good luck with everything. Good luck with the story collection. And congratulations on the publication of What Ben Franklin Would Have Told.
well, thanks so much for having me, Molly. You're so wonderful, really. You're such a great reader
Oh,
and listener. So I appreciate you.
thank you. That is so sweet. You're a fantastic author, and I appreciate you for coming on the show and having such a great conversation with me.
Yeah, well, I'll
Um,
look forward to listening to your other podcast too.
oh, thank you. Yeah. To read between the lines, my name is Molly Southgate.
I'm Donna Gordon.
Let's end this the way all great stories end. Happily ever after.
The
The
end.
end.
Thank you for listening to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. You can follow the show on Instagram and Facebook at Read Between the Lines Podcast and on Twitter at RBTL Podcast. Make sure to follow the authors who I've been talking to hear all about their upcoming projects, and also because they're cool people. This show is hosted by me, Molly Southgate, and produced and edited by my dad, Rob Southgate. Read Between the Lines is a Southgate Media Group production, and you can find all the great content put on by the network at southgatemediagroup.com. You can read the story of how I and many other podcasters started in the anthology book Pod Life, which you'll find at the link in the show notes. Also in the show notes are links to buy the books featured on this episode. Using those links supports this show and the incredible authors being interviewed. Have a great week and keep reading.